Okay, this is the 2:30 panel. We are continuing on the thrilling topic of philosophical and psychological questions. I expect Jackie and Ben will continue to talk about psychoanalysis in the Q&A. We've got three fantastic presenters. We've got Tom Coghlan first, we've got Ben Nicoll second, and we've got Anjum Naweed, who's done back third. Everyone's got 12 minutes. Tom, despite describing himself to me as a recluse, is quite happy for you to take this photo, to take photos of the slides, and to share them for flattering angles only. So, you take your time and get started when you're ready.
I think everyone, admittedly, I typically like having a bit of a rest before presenting, but that last session was so interesting that I didn't want to miss it. So thank you for robbing me of my nap with your compelling research. So my name is Tom Coghlan, and I'm from Bond University on the Gold Coast. I teach in the core curriculum there. And today I'm going to be talking about integrity, the gamer's dilemma, and the role of self-directed moral emotions and the way we frame and reflect on them during and after gameplay. So today I'm just going to kind of put a smattering of ideas on the board and have a very schematic kind of discussion around how they fit together and the type of questions that they might lead us to. One of those concepts is the gamer's dilemma, which has since kind of been reformulated a few times. Maybe some of you have heard of it. Perhaps it's a new idea that I'll be looking at that. And I should say, just as fair warning, because I'm going to be talking about some moral limits of private gameplay, that necessarily invites talking about some extreme and ugly examples, which I won't be presenting in any explicit detail, but just heads up, we'll be talking about kind of the idea of people recreationally engaging in some pretty dubious moral activity. I'm going to try and isolate what the moral states of private video gameplay may be. That's been a fraught project over the last few decades. Talk a little bit about integrity as a virtue, my way of framing integrity, what I believe that means, what it might mean to successfully play morally inflected or confronting games with integrity and how that might fail. And yeah, see how we go. So the gamer's dilemma, if you haven't heard of it, it's basically trying to isolate why people are generally comfortable doing some things in games that they wouldn't do in real life, but then they draw a moral line in other areas, okay, where it's kind of perceived as too far. So the original formulation goes something like this. Most people find in-game murder to be a permissible thing because there's no identifiable external harm in the real world. Yet many people, quite rightly, feel as if acts of virtual pedophilia cross that line. That's even though there's also no external identifiable victim, there seems to be some kind of important moral disparity between the two, despite there being no external harm. So the gamer's dilemma, as it's originally formed, says you have to do one of a few things. You have to either deny that in-game murder is permissible, you need to accept that in-game pedophilia is permissible, or you need to outline what the difference between those two things are. Now, the way I approach this, I don't think we need to necessarily tether it to the example of virtual pedophilia. I think really what we're looking at here is some kind of in-game acts of profound violation that lead to suffering that kind of hits us in an emotional and cognitive way that murder or gameplay surrounding death doesn't necessarily. So in more recent years, it's been reformulated and reframed in various ways. So Luck, who originally presented the dilemma in that form, now calls it the paradox of treating wrongdoing lightly, where it's sometimes difficult for people to articulate why they're willing to kind of treat certain virtual or depictions of wrongdoing as fun or in good conscience, where others feel like they're going too far. Like why, for example, and if we extend it beyond video gameplay, why do people feel quite comfortable with the idea of like a murdery mystery party or something like that? But then if you have like a pedophile practitioner party, it's a very different sort of, even on a recreational level, there seems to be some important difference there. Montefiore and Formosa, they call it the paradox of fictionally going too far. Where is this threshold where we seem to reach some kind of moral excess, where it's no longer permissible, where we can kind of be fairly criticized for what we decide to do? So there's a lot of literature around this across a variety of different fields, actually. I think this paper by Montefiore and Formosa does a really good job of isolating the point of what we're talking about here. Because of course, there's lots of contextual factors around the way people play games and make sense of games, where it's really not a viable approach to say, well, this act has this moral standing in the real world, so it has that equal moral standing in the game. Some of those factors, contextual factors that can change the way we kind of make sense of our in-game actions. Agency, for example, there's a big difference between doing something because it's a necessary thing to progress your playthrough of that game kind of as a text versus something you freely do in a simulation setting. We've got context realism, so what sort of contextual factors around the in-game presentation of that act present it in such a way as you would experience that in a similar way you would experience it in the real world. So for example, murder is normally super gamey, that extreme violation normally is not presented with that kind of ludic interface over top. And perspectival fidelity, or as one person, a friend of mine put it, it feels different killing sex workers in GTA in first person mode. Okay, that's just the example that I think really illustrates what's going on there. So in this paper, Montefiore and Formosa say, look, if we got a game with two modes, okay, and let's imagine that we're keeping all of these contextual factors the same in both modes. One mode is murder mode, and the other one is, in this example, molestation mode. Just imagine some kind of deeply violated in-game act. People generally start to feel uncomfortable morally at a much lower threshold in the latter than they would in the former. That there appears to be a difference. There has since been empirical studies that prove that this disparity does in fact exist, that people, generally speaking, their conscience will kind of come online and they'll start feeling uncomfortable at a much lower kind of perspectival fidelity, much lower contextual kind of threshold. So the questions that we're looking at here is, well, why is there a difference, firstly? And it is a justified difference, or is it a good thing that this difference exists? Intuitively, obviously, a lot of people will say yes, but in terms of getting into, from a normative stance, why that's the case, that's been a little bit choppy in the literature. So here are the key questions. What's the difference? Is there a normative justification for that difference? Another way of framing this, is there good normative reasons why, as players, gamers, or whatever we want to call ourselves, why we are okay with death and murder in games, but aren't okay with this? Is this a good kind of normative thing to strive towards? Is this kind of something that we, from a moral standpoint, should be comfortable kind of aiming for in our lives as players? Another thing that I think is really important to always check in on when we've got these kind of abstract moral arguments and kind of normative standards or ideals, we want to ask, well, are they kind of consistent with the actual lived experience of playing games, with their emotional engagements and entanglements, with their post-gaming reflection and justification, etc.? So in a brief nutshell, I think the application of thin ethical language to states of solitary gameplay is a little bit constrained or very constrained. If we go, and by thin ethical language here, I'm using ethical language like wrong or right, permissible or impermissible. I just think it's very fraught if we start trying to look at kind of categorical types of gameplay and just putting wholesale kind of moral judgments on them. That it doesn't really get to grips with the richness and variety of reasons people play games, way people play games, the environment they're kind of coming to them from, etc. Whereas thick archaic language, so this is a virtue ethics for anyone that's ever encountered any kind of ethical paradigms. Virtual ethics in terms of referencing actions and dispositions against virtues and vices. Just the kind of depth you can get into for the psychological and effective reality of how people play can really capture the stakes there. So instead of saying, what's a bad cliche? Like, okay, what you're doing in this game, its moral standing is contingent on whether or not that behavior leaks into this other area in your life. That's kind of a little bit limited. Whereas if we want to look at a person living a good life, not the good life, we can say things like, okay, this person seems to be habitually self-deceiving in the way they frame their engagements, their justification to others, perceive their kind of own personal reflection, what it means to them, etc. And they're kind of habitually lazy in their self-justification. Something that's kind of freestyle, but it just gives you a little bit more rigorous approach to capturing the kind of moral stakes. So what I think the key question when we look at things like the gamer's dilemma, rather than being, okay, what's wrong or right for us to do in a game, ask the question of what are the conditions of gameplay or our effective experience of it, our motivations for approaching it, and how we feel after the fact, etc. Which of these are compatible with integrity and which are incompatible or which threaten integrity? So integrity is one that's thrown around a lot as a virtue term in various kind of discussions that are going along, but it's actually been quite historically contentious what integrity actually means. So when one person is justifying their gameplay as kind of steadfast authenticity, for example, that's the type of integrity that doesn't capture the kind of fluid and dynamic nature of human life, how we're doing different things in different spheres, we change over time, we challenge ourselves, we grow, we make mistakes, all of these sorts of things. So the account of integrity that I'm developing is called the responsive commitments view. I won't go through all these different ones because they have their shortcomings and they all do capture a part of integrity. But for me, I think it's successfully balancing the core commitments and your self-identity with the dynamic, often fragmented nature of human life and its complex moral demands across a variety of different contexts in pursuit of various goods. Very encumbersome. I'm probably going to change that, but that's where I am for now. And there's lots of ways that can go wrong. I'm not building this kind of exemplary, singular ideal of integrity. I'm framing it as a very agent relative and pluralistic thing, but it does have success conditions. So some of the key takeaway claims about how I think integrity relates to the gamer's dilemma specifically. In-game murder is not immune to threats of integrity. Say, for example, if you've got someone who's, say, a police officer in real life, and in their recreational private gameplay, they like to play police simulators where they intentionally target people of color or something like that. As a habitual thing that would pose some pretty critical questions about their self and professional identity. I'm a little bit more ambivalent about at this point. Personal integrity is not necessarily undermined by involvement with in-game violations. I'm kind of wanting to leave space for certain experiences that try to isolate the harms of tricky content. But in terms of like explicitly putting the player in the agential perspective of doing serious violations against others, I'm yet to hear a kind of really good response to how that doesn't threaten integrity. So very, very quickly, when you look at people's self-rationalization for habitually playing games of violation compared to their justification and effective experience of games involving murder or death, I think that one is generally more compatible with attributions of integrity than the other. Okay, so that's super schematic, bare bones. Love to talk to everyone about it more and hear about your personal examples that come to mind. Thank you.
Next, we've got Ben Nicoll from QUT, Mighty Brisbane. Ben's social media position is go for gold.
Everything's okay, yeah.
Yeah. He's real passionate about it.
Yeah, that's me. Slides up. On special slide. Awesome. Oh, Nicoll. Yeah, perfect. All good. All right, thank you. Okay, so my paper is called The Subject of Video Game Addiction, and I'll just get straight into it. All right, so a profound disagreement, I think, exists between those who view video game addiction as a pathology and those who view it as a pathologizing discourse. And this disagreement largely falls along disciplinary lines. So in the sciences, it's broadly accepted that people can become problematically addicted to video games. Whereas in the humanities, by contrast, I guess most of us would consider ourselves skeptics. So for us, video game addiction is less a medical reality and more a medical discourse. So a discourse that stigmatizes obsessive, impassioned gameplay as pathological. So behavioral scientists like Mark D. Griffiths et al. Defend the pathologization of video game addiction by claiming that their research is, quote, not about pathologizing healthy entertainment, but about pathologizing excessive and problematic behaviors that cause significant psychological distress and impairment. Now, they do their argument no favors by using pathologizing phrases like healthy entertainment, but I think we should nonetheless acknowledge that many people do self-identify as being addicted to video games in this way. Consider, for example, Ryan G. Van Cleve's testimonial from his memoir, Unplugged, where he writes, "I refuse to let some self-important egghead tell me it's not an addiction when I couldn't stop playing World of Warcraft. I really couldn't help myself. I finally nearly killed myself because I couldn't summon the will to quit playing WoW." So I think it's possible to take Van Cleve's testimonial and others like it at face value, while still recognizing that video game addiction is at least partially a function of discourse. So my opening wager is that our preoccupation with addiction discourse in the humanities has left us kind of bereft of our own theory of how and why people like Van Cleve might become addicted to video games. And my aim in this paper is to develop such a theory, and I'm going to draw on psychoanalysis. So this is like a philosophical approach. And my contention is that a psychoanalytic approach to video game addiction can counterbalance the scientific one by focusing on the subject of video game addiction rather than the psychology or the object of video game addiction. So whereas psychology would imply that there's something going on in the brains of people who become addicted to video games, or object would imply that there's something in video games that causes addiction, subject implies a different kind of approach. So by subjective addiction, what I mean is a being whose addiction emerges from a particularly vexed relationship with what Jacques Lacan, the French psychoanalyst, calls the other with a capital O, or the big other. So the other for Lacan is not a person. The other is more like a diffuse social authority that, in Slavoj Žižek's terms, represents the substance of our social being, the thick social network of written and unwritten rules and patterns. Now, for Lacan, to be a subject, and this goes for subjectivity in general for him, to be a subject is to undergo the universally alienating experience of failing to mold oneself to these social rules and patterns. So subjectivity for Lacan is defined by a constitutive failure, by this failure. So the subject, in other words, fails to attain the ostensibly limitless enjoyment of becoming what it presumes the other desires. Again, subjectivity in general here. And enjoyment is a really key term for me. So the reason for this failure is that the desire of the other is itself lacking. So the other is ontologically inconsistent for Lacan. But the failure of subjectivity, this failure, is nonetheless necessary because it precipitates a separation of subject from other. So by renouncing the impossible enjoyment of becoming what the other desires, the subject gains access to a more ordinary form of enjoyment that enables it to live its life. The subject of addiction has a somewhat different relationship to the other. So rather than arriving at enjoyment through the long detour of an alienating encounter with the other, the addict tries to administer enjoyment at will. So they try to cut the other out of the equation. So drug addicts, for example, attempt to administer enjoyment independently of the other through persistent substance use. Gambling addicts try to avoid the risk of an encounter with the desire of the other by instead confronting the other as a game of chance. So if addiction is often ideologically constructed as a disability of the will, this is sometimes a thing people would say, it's a disability of the will, I think psychoanalysis counters by seeing addiction as an excess of the will. So addiction for psychoanalysis represents an attempt by the subject to directly gain mastery over enjoyment without detour through the other. Now, the subject of video game addiction, I think, likewise tries to avoid an alienating encounter with the other in favor of immediate access to enjoyment. Now, the video game addict is a bit like the gambling addict, I think, in that both try to exclude the question of desire from their relationship with the other. So they're trying to cut that question out. But what distinguishes the video game addict, this is my core argument, is that the video game addict confronts the other as the locus of a pure demand rather than a game of chance, which is what we see in gambling addiction. So what do I mean by this? So it's often argued that gameplay is satisfying, in part because it presents us with straightforward demands. So if life under neoliberal capitalism is characterized by the frustration of not having the enjoyment we feel we're owed for fulfilling meritocratic demands, then gameplay functions like a kind of antidote. So gameplay administers enjoyment in exchange for our fulfillment of fair, transparent demands. So you could say in gameplay, we encounter an other whose demands are straightforward and sensible, rather than opaque and inconsistent. Now, the subject of video game addiction attempts to administer enjoyment at will by inhabiting the other's demand completely. And this enables them to avoid the risk of an encounter with the desire of the other. I think we see a nice example of this in addiction to online play, which is a very common form of addiction. So although online play, takes many different forms, obviously, it tends to involve competition or collaboration with other players. Now, when we encounter other subjects in everyday life, we encounter them through the prism of desire. So desire is opaque and inconsistent. We never quite know what other people want from us, and this is partly what makes social encounters so anxiety-inducing. But when playing games online, we tend to encounter other players not as desiring subjects, but as friends or enemies whose demands appear transparent both to themselves and to us. So it's no surprise, I think, that video game addiction tends to be linked to online play, for it's an online play where the encounter with the other as pure demand is most pronounced. So in this sense, we might say that the problem with video game addiction is not that it represents a withdrawal from reality. Like so many video game theorists have critiqued this commonsensical assumption rightly. The problem is rather that the video game addict's relationship with the other is far too realistic, in that it's premised on a consistent demand. The video game addicts cannot countenance the fact that the other's demand is internally inconsistent, that the other is lacking. All right, now, if the cause of video game addiction is in the subject, as I've been arguing, where does that leave the object? The idea that video games facilitate a fruitless attempt to administer enjoyment at will seems to render them roughly equivalent to gambling technologies. Now, most video game theorists respond to this conflation of video games with gambling technologies by arguing that the two are nothing alike. I propose a more dialectical approach. So what's distinctive about video games, I claim, is that they can both administer enjoyment, yes, but they can also expose us to our own enjoyment. Gambling technologies can administer enjoyment, but they can't expose us to it. If they were to begin exposing us to our own enjoyment, they would become more like video games and less like gambling technologies. As an example of a game that exposes players to their own enjoyment, I want to use Zelda Link's Awakening, which is a game published in 1993 for the Game Boy, and as we all know, it's the best Zelda game. So the central conceit of Link's Awakening is that Link has become trapped in a dream. Not his dream, but the dream of the windfish, a mysterious entity that inhabits an island Link has become marooned on. Now, Link's task is to liberate himself from this dream by rousing the windfish. When the player satisfies this task, the game ends. The island, along with its inhabitants, disappears. Link then awakens in the middle of the ocean, surrounded by the remnants of his shipwreck. Like most Zelda games, Link's Awakening begins by issuing clear demands to the player. A talking owl occasionally visits Link to offer guidance. The owl's demands are simple: wake the windfish, fulfill your destiny. However, once the characters in the game cotton onto Link's quest, they try to convince him to stop. Dungeon bosses plead with Link to abandon his quest. The islanders become increasingly melancholic as the game progresses, reminding Link to keep them in his memories once he leaves the island. The owl implores Link to put his reservations aside and focus on the task at hand. In this way, Link's Awakening draws attention to a lack in the other's demand. The other of Link's Awakening does not know what it wants. Its demands are internally inconsistent. They're shot through with contradiction. And this lends the game a very well-known alienating quality. Rather than allowing players to luxuriate in the consistency of the other's demand, Link's Awakening alienates players in the inconsistency of the other's desire. So games such as Link's Awakening expose players to the impossibility of fulfilling the other's demand completely. In an essay on video game addiction, Francis Butterworth Parr develops the idea of critical immersion to describe something like I'm describing. For him, the critically immersive work doesn't express the real, but exposes reality's contradictions, deprivileging the claimed primacy that escapism ascribes to reality. So by exposing reality's contradictions, games such as Link's Awakening reveal that the satisfaction we get from playing games is not really a matter of fulfilling the other's demand at all, as much as games promise us that that is where the satisfaction comes from. Instead, the satisfaction of playing games comes from a failure to inhabit the other's demand completely, from the ordinary enjoyment of circling but never attaining the object of desire. So this is my final slide. I think a proper understanding of what makes video games textually significant, which would be that they have this capacity to both administer and expose us to our enjoyment, can't be separated from an understanding of what makes them potentially appealing to the subject of addiction. So the subject of addiction is drawn to perhaps video games because it enables them to cut the other out of the equation and access enjoyment directly. But video games are also capable of undermining that whole premise as well, and that makes them textually significant. Thank you.
One of the many
Yeah.
people I hope. What does Anjum do? So someone's going to do
Far out, this is a good panel, isn't it? Thank you, Ben. Next, we have Anjum Naweed from Central Queensland University, but confusingly, he is located in Adelaide, and my New Zealand brain cannot process these two things. And Anjum is returning to DiGRA Australia conferences after several years away from the scene. So magnetic attraction never ends. And Anjum is going to talk to us about the virtual pandemic.
Thanks for that. I'm assuming I use the right arrow to progress. Okay, great. I just want to acknowledge my co-authors here, Lorelle, Tania, and Janine, particularly Lorelle, who I dragged away from her PhD to pursue this research as a team. I always like to sort of try to capture the essence of my talk in a quote or two to sort of get the inspiration to do the actual PowerPoint. So for this one, I've got this one by Hakar the Soulflay, a malevolent blood god of the Gurubashi Empire. Pride heralds the end of your world. Come mortals, face the wrath of the Soulflayer. And then I've got this one, an anonymous 20th century proverb. In times of crisis, the soul of a community is tested. So we all know what this is. Yeah, shout it out. What is it? World of Warcraft or WoW. So we all know what WoW is about. It's an MMORPG, it's a fancy world exploration, and you do a whole lot of crazy stuff in the game, including strategically raiding the dwellings of powerful creatures in teams. So in September 2005, we had a new combative raid encounter with the end boss, the author of the quote that I gave you earlier, Hakar. Now, Hakar had a corrupted blood spell, and this was a hit point draining debuff, which drained the health, in other words, of its attackers, and it spread to nearby players. There was a computer bug, and what that meant was that it actually spread into the World of Warcraft beyond the encounter and lasted around 25 days. This may be triggering, but go back there. The actual end result was not rocks. It's been correct. Rocks is actually just lots and lots and lots of skeletons, as you can sort of see. Carpeting, iron forged there. So this was a big event, and obviously it's been used a lot in quite a lot of research, particularly epidemiology, which characterizes it as a black swan event. And it's been explored, considered, reviewed, researched for its infectivity, transmission patterns, and there has been anecdotal insights around the kinds of behaviors that we saw during corrupted blood, insights around the risks that people were taking, or the risky behaviors that we saw, also altruism and antisocial behaviors. But a lot of this is from player blogs and forums. We haven't actually seen much empirical research on the topic. And so really the aim of this was to look at the retrospective lived experiences of people that were involved in corrupted blood, or actually had first-hand or second-hand experience of it, with the rationale that there's a lot of underlying theory about immersion and narrative involvement, and the fact that there may actually be a liminal space in which the person kind of crosses that boundary, becomes their player. The online persona that we write into existence actually functions as evocative objects, but also really just to sort of see whether it can shed light, the behaviors can shed light themselves on real-world pandemics on the road to recovery. This philosophical position was one of social constructivism. Reality is not a fixed entity, but one that's shaped by our collective experiences and human behaviors and so on. And it was also informed partly by crisis theory, particularly work by Erickson on collective trauma, which explains how individuals and communities respond to crises, and also identities are reformed as a result of trauma. Methodologically, we had a simple design: collect the data, do it through a survey, international, first-hand or second experience. Second experience was typically people that observed another person going through corrupted blood, and to reflect on that experience, but also to reflect on COVID-19. So this survey was run in circa mid-2020, not long after we had COVID-19 declared a global pandemic. And the lockdown started here in Australia and various states, and we had ethical approvals too. So you can see we had, in the end, 59 people that were included in this data set, but we had more than 100 responses. It was only open for a couple of weeks. Lots of people from the US, but also from other parts of the world. So these were the three core themes. I used thematic networks. We use thematic network analysis for this, which basically is about trying to visualize your coding. You have a global metaphor, you have your organizing themes, and then you have your basic themes. So it's basically three-level structure. But then you also have, if you want to, you can use focus codes, which collect a lot of the units of data that inform your basic themes. Just want to go through some of these so you can sort of see where the data lay. So for the pandemic was unstoppable. And these numbers tell you in brackets the total number of units that were coded across the 59 survey respondents, and then 37.2% shows the proportion of the total data set that found its way into this code. So we had these four themes, organizing themes. We had these four basic themes around the organizing theme of the pandemic was unstoppable. Let's have a look at some of these. So bug came on swift wings. We had flee, live, die, repeat. The death toll was catastrophic, which was a shameless reference to the Phantom Menace. No place was safe or free from contagion. You can sort of see some of the comments that people made. Lots of individual people saying it was vivid. I remember vividly, you couldn't avoid it. Corpses were carpeting Ironforge. Even recovering your corpse was lethal, which is the title of the present, and also a delicious quote. Bug did not discriminate, so level cap players were dying. Characters were asymptomatic. Pets could get infected as well. So even at the highest level, you didn't last very long, and you couldn't even get near NPCs or you'd fall over dead. Human factor, which is that the idea that a lot of the things that we were doing intentionally or unintentionally engendered a unstoppability around pandemic. Confusion reigned, infection could be spread by accident, was denial, disbelief, and also the idea that we were people, or certain kinds of characters were invincible. Why was it happening to them? Even I, a holy paladin, was confused and died a lot before realizing what was going on. And so there's this feeling of invulnerability as well as denial and disbelief for some of the players. And you can sort of see that there was also this idea of if it bleeds, it leads. Curiosity killed the cat. People stopped what they were doing and went to actually see what all the fuss was about, or wanted to view, you know, the event happening from a quote unquote safe distance, like on top of the building. The system was set up for corrupted blood to flourish, power and powerlessness in systems of governments and urban service industries. So you can see here that, you know, in all these service industries, banks and auction houses, people were keeling over, particularly. And the game developers didn't really know what was going on according to, you know, the feedback that was received. The whole system collapsed and people couldn't actually contact anybody to see what's going on. And the last quote, which you can't see, says, "I initially thought it was just a funny exploit. The fact is that it looked like a lot of other things that you see in parts of the world and in trade encounters." This next theme, which was the largest theme, pandemic stress, characterizes, I think, most of what people were feeling and experiencing in the height of the pandemic that we experienced in the real world, which was that the corrupted blood pandemic corrupted more than blood. Anarchy reigned, people turned into agents of destruction and ruin. And I actually am now thinking about the meaning of the word destruction a bit more, following the presentation by Andreas. Violating social and cultural norms and profiting from the crisis. So we had a lot of these commentary around, you know, people wanting to spread it intentionally, people ignoring quote unquote social norms and rules in order to actually spread it further, and then people actually gaining benefit from it. So on the right here, you can see someone unleashing a spell to an area effect damage spell, getting lots of honor before they died, but it was worth it. And then I logged out resurrection sickness for this third theme, pandemic stress, which was also, I'm still talking about this theme now. Here we are. It's hard to navigate this with that, the subtitle thing in the bottom right. So this one was interesting because a lot of people basically said, well, I just logged out of the game. I didn't want to play, and I came back into it for a few days. And we had some comments around that. Some people saying, well, I couldn't go back into my body. I had to stay, you know, outside of town, got resurrection sickness, go anywhere to kill me. And so you had this idea that people was literally just becoming, you know, ghosts walking around, figuring out what to do with themselves. Navigating the disruption, impact service systems, piecing information together through live chat, misinformation and restricting movement and engagement. So there was very little that people could actually do to function in the game of, in the World of Warcraft as it was originally designed. And in order to actually understand what was going on, it was very difficult to sort of do that because of all the misinformation that was in the channels, chat channels. Some populations were more at risk. Low-level players didn't stand a chance. Being able to kill yourself offered some protection. So you can sort of see here that, you know, a lot of people were talking about, well, if you couldn't heal yourself, then, you know, you were pretty much, you know, done for, because being a character that had that ability was valuable. Fear, unease, and uncertainty was a frustrating experience, and it's all fun and games until someone loses an eye. There was a sense of fear around visiting popular cities. A lot of people talked about the turn. It started off really amusing, but then became really irritating or unenjoyable, and there was mild level panic anxiety for the first while. And this last theme here, mattering in times of crisis and uncertainty. So we had these ideas really that a lot of people were making sacrifices, and there was actually a lot of people that took charge, standing outside city gates, warning others, trying to reduce the impact where they can, healing folks. I played an undead priest and remember how good it felt to be a healer in a time of need. So we actually had these two traditional factions in the world kind of unite in many ways. And there was a bit of this pre-monitoring and sharing information to prevent the spread. So, you know, a lot of guilds got together and did what they could to sort of help others that were in times of need. And this idea of, you know, finding a new normal, what do we do now? People became distrustful of others when they saw them in case they were going to go for them. And, you know, modified what they were doing and how they were doing so they could continue to actually function and exist in the world. And over time, this has turned into a tale of yore, a story that people tell to others when they're playing, especially when they come across, you know, Hakar, the Soul Slayer again, whenever he sort of turns up. And this idea that it's been an enduring experience for many that some were happy to be part of, but also it's left kind of a legacy. So the global metaphor for this really was when the virtual became virtually real. And when you kind of unpack that, it's really about that idea that, these experiences of the virtual world in many ways did cross the world, the virtual world into the real world. We had people that were staying up all night trying to help others, and sacrificing their time, not going to school and so on. Contemplation of a virtual experience feeling vivid and immersive was also quite important. It became subjectively real through the experiences of those players and their interactions with the game. Perceptions of danger, risk, and consequences influenced their behavior and choices. And also, it became intertwined with people's constructions of their own virtual identities. Now, just the last minute, we did also look at the links between this and COVID-19, given that our participants provided some of this data. This was a deductive coding scheme, so we used the exact codes that were created as part of the corrupted blood experience and then applied those to COVID-19, no new ones, to actually see, well, what's the verisimilitude between them? And you can sort of see here, this is at the basic theme level. All the way down, navigating disruption was clearly the one that a lot of people talked about in circa mid-2020, and then finding a new normal, making sacrifices, things about mattering in times of crisis, uncertainty, and pandemic stress. Things like the pandemic being unstoppable didn't really kind of come up as much, which tells us a bit about the virtual versus the non-virtual and so on. That's the presentation. Thanks for your time.
I was remiss in paying attention that Anjum's position on social media is go for gold and tag him if you can. That from you're on, and an update from Lauren is that the entire previous panel were happy with social media sharing. Yes, I think. So questions for our three wonderful presenters. Maybe I'll start you off, Tom, with one that you had online from Verdant, who asked, I wonder how it works with VR. Are the players more hesitant to the point that they stop playing the game? So I guess the question is, how does the framework interact with VR? Get another microphone.
Yes. So just typically that kind of perspective or when gestural kind of fidelity changes that affecting engagement and the feeling of a gentle closeness. Yeah.
Also,
Typically.
if you ask a question, it would be lovely if you could introduce yourself to know each other. Hugh, you're next.
Finn Wilson. I've got a question for Ben. I love the talk, and I may have just not been following all of it. So if you explain this really clearly, we can talk about this later. You said games administer and expose.
Yeah.
Correct.
Right.
And you said gambling does not expose.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could maybe explain that a little bit more, go a bit deeper as to why gambling doesn't expose, or is it possible for gambling to expose? Is there, and maybe part of the issue is I don't exactly know what the difference between administer and expose is in this case.
Okay, so yeah, okay, so enjoyment for Lacan is normally something that we get through an encounter with the other. So you have to sort of encounter the other and encounter the lack in the other, like the inconsistency of the other. And that failure is the failure of subjectivity. And that's what kind of generates enjoyment. So I didn't really provide a very good definition of it, or at all really in the paper, but enjoyment is not pleasure. It's a kind of like surplus satisfaction that we get from failure. So there's that. The idea with addiction, and I'm getting this from the psychoanalytic literature on addiction, is that what the addict is addicted to is something that enables them to cut the other out of the equation, to access enjoyment directly without having to go through the rigmarole of an alienating encounter with the other. And I think something like a gambling technology maybe does that. So it administers enjoyment at will. So you don't need to go through this tricky question of like the other and the other's desire. You just kind of administer enjoyment for yourself. I think what makes video games a bit different is that they're capable of exposing us to that enjoyment and exposing us to, I guess, the way in which that enjoyment really relates to a lack in the other's demand. So rather than just giving us an other whose demands are always consistent and clear, and by doing so, just giving us enjoyment, we encounter, like in a game like Link's Awakening, we encounter a lacking other, like an inconsistent other. And that, I think, is when you're exposed to your enjoyment. Like, what I mean by that is like, your satisfaction is not where you think it is. Like, you thought your satisfaction was here, but actually it's somewhere else, and it's linked to failure. It's linked to this failure of approximating the desire of the other. That was quite jargon heavy, and I'm happy to unpack it more later, but yeah, thank you.
Thank you all. Unfortunately, my question is also for Bill, and I really appreciate the work that you're attempting to do here, both in sort of the psychoanalytic realms that applies to video games and the play of video games, motivations to play and to overplay video games. I think it's like, it's global and evergreen, but it's also really ambitious to try and present in a format this brief.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed your formulation of video game addiction as an excess rather than a lack.
Yeah.
I think that's a really kind of key point. Is that correct? Have I made that?
Yeah, like an excess of the will.
Yes,
Yeah,
excess
yeah.
of the will.
I think,
Yes.
yeah.
But I'm not sure that I've fully grasped the conclusion. I wanted to sort of re-articulate and sort of mirror back if it's correct or not. Is it that the satisfaction of playing games comes from the desire on the part of the subject to sort of ameliorate a sense of alienation?
Yeah.
But while also perpetuating that alienation in the process.
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. So there's this. So actually, that's probably a better answer to Finn's question, which is that like, yeah, the desire is to administer enjoyment at will is to overcome alienation. But like, alienation is constitutive of subjectivity. And apologies to Marx, because like Marx sort of views alienation as something that can be overcome. And I get what he's saying there, but like for Lacan, alienation is part of what it means to be a subject. It's not linked to economics necessarily. It's just that we are alienated in ourselves and from each other to a certain degree. But that's also what gives us solidarity. But yeah, so sorry, just to circle back. So games promise to overcome alienation, but they also expose us to it. Yeah, and expose us to the fact that we get enjoyment from that alienation. Yeah.
Thanks, Ben. Hey, we got some questions in the queue online, both Ben and Tom, but do we have anyone Anjum just in there? Oh, straight up.
Yeah, thanks. I really enjoyed that presentation. I'm Jesse Olson. What was particularly interesting was this, how you were trying the themes out from the virtual pandemic to the real pandemic. And I wonder if there's any indication that people who experienced this virtual pandemic were somehow trained and it impacted how they helped people, or whether, since you did the interviews and you said in mid-2020, whether the interview itself might have inspired them to apply the framework, and then and that would be, I guess, a follow-up study. But it was just a thought about whether there would have been benefits in the real world from that experience.
Yeah, thanks for that. It's one of the things that we are looking at with the research, because it is the experience of a virtual pandemic and what we sort of saw in this Black Swan event. Can you find and derive insights from that tell us about how people recover, how people sort of, deploy altruistic behaviors in a real pandemic? Given that for many people, the virtual pandemic felt very real because it kind of drew on all those sorts of behavioral markers that most of us, and if not all of us, experienced during COVID-19. When we asked them to first reflect on, I think it was a survey, when we asked them to first reflect on corrupted blood, they did so by describing, the scenario, what they went through, and it was an open field box, and most of them, wrote war keys. Some of them wrote very small amounts. lots of emojis and all that. And then that was followed up by, based on your recollection of this now, tell us about what your experiences of COVID-19 have been. And a lot of people made commentaries about, oh, now that you mention it, it's shockingly similar. Oh my Lord, that kind of thing. Other people sort of said, no, that was a game. This is real life. People die in real life. But then there were some people that said, I think it's immaterial whether people die in the game or not. This is exactly the same. It feels exactly the same. I'm feeling the same things that I felt, now on 20 years ago. So it's interesting. And what would be really good to do is to actually look at people now rather than in the throes of isolation and lockdowns and all that, whether what they did after that was the similar kinds of behaviors that they sort of saw then. And that might give us an idea about how people recover, but also choose to actually interact with it as step forward. Yeah.
And whether the ones that you interviewed did better than the ones you didn't interview.
Surveys. We didn't interview them, who were so responsive. Yeah, it's true. Yeah, we could, draw up cases and have a look and actually see whether we could explore that maybe in a separate study. Thanks for that question.
Hello. I'm Marianne. You can also call me Dr. Butt. So I have two questions for Ben. One less spicy, one more spicy. So less spicy, how do you distinguish the ideal game subject from the video game addict? And how do they relate, or how do they relate and overlap? Right, like the ideal game or subject.
Right.
Yeah. And spicy question is why Lacan, why psychoanalysis?
I actually think the other way around. I think the first one was spicy. Because I think the implication of your first question is that I have the kind of, maybe it's used term, like a global conception of subjectivity, of like normal subjectivity versus the addict or something. Is that kind of what you mean? Or like I'm sort of maintaining some ideal of the subject in games. Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Like creating subjectivity and constructing that.
That's a bit different to what I thought. So you mean like how does the game
Gamer subject.
Yeah. How they like ideologically interpolated or how?
So just like thinking about that, right?
Oh, sorry. No.
Yeah, I was specifically inspired to think of that question when you were talking about the video game addict is like, I guess, someone who wants to pretty much spend all their time playing video games.
Yeah.
But that is also, I guess, what the ideal gamer is.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I think the idea there would be that like the unconscious element of playing games is that like games issue demands and they give us desires, right? I'm not the only person to kind of say this. And a lot of the time I think, we're patterning our desires on those desires, like whether we consciously know it or not. So an example could be like mastery, like most games just assume that people want to achieve mastery, and like maybe some people unconsciously pattern their desires on those assumptions, right? So I guess that would be the interpolation element. And I think that to bring it back to addiction, perhaps there's an assumption that you want to just inhabit the other's demand completely, that you just want to fully satisfy the other. And the ideal gamer, I guess, would do that, would just satisfy the other completely. But I think that there's something very radical in the opposite, which is to recognize the lack in the other. And I think that's what some games facilitate. So they expose us to the fact that the other doesn't know, that the other is inconsistent, that its desires are shot through with contradiction. And games are capable of exposing us to that and undermining, therefore, any desire to fully inhabit the other's demand. And I think there's something very radical about that, very radical about acknowledging the lack in the other. Yeah. Oh, the other question. Maybe I'll leave that one to later. So this
You have an online question, Tom, from Nancy McKenzie, who many of us know is creative director of the Free Play Festival. They ask, listen up, it's a long one. Have you done much research into how demography impacts feelings of integrity on certain topics. The police example made me think of broader demographic things, like how race might play into responses to slavery or gender might play into responses to molestation. So,
Yeah, definitely in that, I think a useful conception of integrity needs to take the person's particular kind of lived experience and background into it. One example that I think is useful for analysis, a very simple one, is that say for example, there's a game that simulates it simulates a classroom where you're a teacher, and the aim of the game is to treat the students with neglect and disdain. Someone who is not a teacher versus someone who is a teacher and likes that aspect of their identity, and then versus someone who is a teacher but for whatever reason hates teaching, how they incorporate that gameplay into their sense of self will be different, absolutely. And I do think that part of compartmentalizing identity in our gameplay, that closeness can be a factor. Like if we're talking about recreational, so not trying to kind of use games as kind of critical commentary on some kind of issue or use them to explore identities, but just as kind of purely idle fun. Playing something that's too close to your lived experience and sense of self outside of your identity as a player subject, I think is in some ways more dangerous than at a distance, depending on the thing. It's really context dependent, which is the kind of type of integrity that I'm really trying to emphasize, that it's not a one size fits all, that it's not a, stick to your guns no matter what the guns are, that it really is a case by case basis for sure.
thanks, Tom. Okay, we're bang on time. So I'm not a conference organizer, but I can see there's food out there. So I'm going to say there's afternoon tea provided. And that's what's happening next. And we're back here in 20 minutes. Oh, yeah, people are giving me eyebrows. I'm going to write. So big round of applause for our fantastic.
Yeah.